The rain came in sideways that Thursday evening, the kind that didn't fall so much as lean against everything it touched. The gutters along Harwick Street ran brown with the season's first cold. Inside the shop, the overhead fluorescence buzzed at a frequency that felt like a migraine trying to introduce itself. Callum Forday was 25 years old, and he was very good at what he did, and he knew it, which was the problem. The shop was his uncle's technically. Gerald Ford had owned Ford Son Precision Works for 31 years before his knees gave out, and the doctor used the word degenerative 3 separate times in one appointment. Gerald had handed Callum the keys on a Tuesday in July, along with a ring binder full of supplier contacts and a single piece of advice. Listen to the guns. They'll tell you what they need. Callum had nodded and smiled, and promptly filed the ring binder under the counter, where old instruction manuals went to decompose. He'd reorganized the shop within a week. Out went the dusty display cases full of single-action revolvers and Milsur bolt actions from before the Korean War. In came a clean glass counter, backlit blue, showcasing the work that Callum actually cared about: precision-machined modern platforms, custom triggers, chassis systems, free-floating barrels in matte black and FDE. The shop smelled now of Hoppy's No. 9 and ambition. He had a reputation among the competitive shooting crowd. Not just locally, people drove 3 hours to have Callum Forday do a trigger job. He'd placed in 3 state-level precision rifle matches before deciding that competing interfered with billing. He understood ballistics the way some people understood music, intuitively, in the bones, ahead of the math. He was also, by almost every account of those who worked alongside him, insufferable about it. "Bring me that Schmidt and Bender," he said to his apprentice without looking up from the bench. Dawson Riley, 19, moved fast. He'd been working with Callum for 4 months. He'd learned that please was not a word in regular circulation in this shop, and that speed was a form of courtesy. Callum was working on a Tikka T3X CTR, a customer build, competition spec. The rifle was already accurate. His job was to make it arrogant. He'd lapped the action, bedded the stock with DevCon, set the trigger brake at 11 ounces, and was now boring himself with the scope mounting because it was the kind of work that didn't require him. "You know what this costs?" he said, holding the optic up to the light. "The scope?" Dawson said. "Around $4,000. $4,240. Callum set it down with care that was automatic, reflexive, not reverent. "And it'll still lose to a guy who practices." Funny how that works. He didn't really think it was funny. There was a brass cartridge case on the corner of his bench, a .338 Lapua Magnum. He kept it there as a kind of aesthetic statement. He'd taken it from the waste bin of a customer who'd brought in a rifle from the late 80s. A heavy old bolt gun built during what Callum privately called the age of good intentions and bad metallurgy. The customer had been nostalgic about it. Callum had been polite about the nostalgia and privately certain the rifle was a relic that deserved a museum case and nothing more. "Old guns," he said to Dawson, apropos of nothing, while adjusting the ring torque. Dawson waited. People assign them meaning, sentiment. They think age is the same as quality. He set the torque wrench down. It isn't. A modern precision rifle will outperform a 1960s custom build in every measurable category. Wind drift, consistency, user interface, every category. He picked up the cartridge case, turned it in his fingers. The only reason to own something old is if you can't afford something new, or if you're attached to a story that the gun itself can't tell anymore. Dawson had learned not to respond to these monologues. They weren't conversations. They were Callum thinking out loud with a witness present. The bell above the door rang. She came in from the rain with a canvas bag over one shoulder and water on her jacket that she didn't acknowledge. Late 40s, maybe early 50s, it was hard to place her. She wore it oddly, her age like a rank, not a loss. Her hair was cut short, silver gray at the temples and not the soft decorative kind. Military short, practical short. The jacket was waxed cotton, dark green, worn down at the cuffs. She walked to the counter without browsing. People who knew what they wanted moved like that. Callum watched her from the bench, still holding the torque wrench. She set the canvas bag on the glass counter gently, but not delicately, and stepped back without speaking. "Help you?" Callum said. "I need an assessment." Her voice was even. Low register, precise articulation. The kind of voice that didn't rise at the end of statements to invite agreement. Callum walked to the counter. He unzipped the canvas bag. Inside was a rifle. It was bad. That was his first, second, and third impression. The barrel was pitted along a 6-inch section near the muzzle. The stock wood, original, unmodified, was cracked at the pistol grip and wrapped at some point in paracord that had since dried out and frayed. The action was stiff from what looked like a decade of improper storage. Surface rust covered the receiver in a texture like old orange peel. The scope rings were mismatched. There was no scope. The whole thing looked like something salvaged from a flood. Callum looked at it for 3 seconds. Then he laughed. It wasn't unkind, exactly. It was the laugh of a man who has seen something confirm everything he already believed. The laugh of a person being vindicated by the universe. Ma'am. He picked up the rifle by the stock, one-handed, and held it sideways under the fluorescent light, like a man presenting evidence. This thing couldn't hit a paper plate at 100 meters. I could print tighter groups with a .22 pistol. He set it back down. What do you want done with it? She looked at him. Not at the rifle. At him. Read the serial number, she said. He almost didn't. The request landed like something beneath his pay grade. A starting point that beginners used. Not craftsmen. But there was something in her tone. Not urgency. The opposite. The absolute absence of urgency, which in a strange way was more commanding. He found the receiver, turned it, found the stamp under the rust film. He picked up a shop rag and cleaned the surface methodically, because the habit was older than his contempt, and then held it under the magnifying lamp. The number was there, faint but precise, military stamped, deep struck. Beside it, a proof mark he didn't immediately recognize. He wrote the serial on a yellow notepad. Then he pulled up the database on the shop's desktop, a subscription service used by licensed dealers for provenance checks and stolen firearms queries. He typed in the number. No record found. He typed it again. No record found. Systems probably just, he frowned. He cross-referenced with a second database. Same result. He tried a third, a federalized archive that required his FFL credentials and a 2-step verification. He hadn't used it in 8 months. Record restricted. Classification, historical, operational. Contact originating agency for access. He stopped. He looked at the rifle, then at her. She hadn't moved. She was standing with her hands in her jacket pockets, her eyes on the far wall where Callum had hung a framed target, his best competition group, 5 shots inside a 1/4 inch at 500 yards like a credential. She was looking at it the way a surgeon might look at a medical school diploma on a waiting room wall. Callum had a secondary terminal in the back office, old and slow, connected through a legacy interface to an archive of government-released military procurement records, something Gerald had set up years ago to help with estate transfers of military surplus. Callum had never used it. He'd considered disconnecting it. He went to the back. Dawson watched without asking questions. He was learning. The terminal took 4 minutes to boot. The search interface was text-only, DOS-era ugly. He entered the serial number. The system worked for a long time. Then the screen populated. Callum read. His lips stopped moving. He read it twice. The rifle was designated under a classified materiel program run in the mid-2000s. The program name meant nothing to him, but the notes attached to the record, partially redacted, the blackout bars blocky and definitive, contained a reference to an operational use log, and in that log, a single entry, flagged with a marker he had to look up in the glossary at the bottom of the screen. Exceptional engagement. Confirmed. Distance. 3,540. Below that, status. Asset destroyed. Lost in field. Decommissioned record. Callum sat very still in the old office chair. 3,540 meters. He knew what that number meant. Anyone who worked in this world knew what that number meant. It sat at the edge of the humanly possible, the kind of distance where the curvature of the Earth became a ballistic variable, where the shooter had to account for the Coriolis effect of the planet itself rotating beneath the bullet's path, where the physics stopped being physics and started being a kind of argument with God. The record holders in that range were counted in single digits. Their names were known, some of them He walked back out to the counter. The woman was still there, still in the same position. She'd looked at the framed target and, apparently, found everything she needed to find in it and moved on. "The system says this rifle was declared lost," Callum said. "I know," she said. "It also says," he paused, organized the words, "there's an engagement record attached to this serial, a confirmed engagement at 3,540 meters. That's not possible with this platform." He said it automatically, the reflex of a man who'd spent his entire adult life in the geometry of ballistics. The barrel length, the caliber signature in the record, this isn't a platform designed for that range. The inherent accuracy at distance would be sufficient, she said. One word, flat, not aggressive, just precisely sufficient. That record has been classified, she continued. They declassified the distance last year. The name stays redacted. Callum looked at the rifle again. A different kind of looking. He reached out and picked it up two-handed this time. 14 years earlier, the valley was a killing zone, and everyone in it knew it. The outpost sat on a ridgeline that had seemed defensible until it wasn't. 31 personnel, 2 vehicles, 1 working radio, and a supply line that had been compromised for 6 hours. The temperature had dropped from 98 degrees Fahrenheit at midday to 41 degrees Fahrenheit after dark. The mountains didn't care about the difference. The wind came down from the north in gusts that hit 40 knots and turned sand into a grinding thing that found every seam in every piece of gear. Sergeant First Class Vivienne Holt lay in a shallow depression on a rock shelf 400 meters above the outpost perimeter. She'd been there for 3 hours. She would be there for 3 more if required. She was 36 years old. She'd been doing this since she was 22. The rifle was not the one she'd been issued. The one she'd been issued was at the bottom of a ravine with the vehicle it had been traveling in. This one had been recovered from a situation she didn't discuss and modified by her own hands over 4 years of off-record work tolerances tightened, trigger group rebuilt from scratch, barrel recrowned in a machine shop in Vicenza during a week of leave she'd spent entirely indoors. The scope had been destroyed in the same incident as the vehicle. She was using iron sights. Nobody who had not been there would believe that. She had stopped explaining it. The threat element was positioned in a dry creek bed at the base of the far ridge, coordinating, reorganizing, preparing a second assault on the position below. In the darkness and wind, at a distance that her rangefinder had last read as 3,540 meters before it fogged over and became useless, they believed themselves safe. That was a reasonable belief. By any conventional military standard, they were safe. Vivienne had spent 40 minutes reading the wind. Not with instruments. She didn't have working instruments at that range in those conditions. She read it with her body, with the fine hairs on her forearms, with the sound it made against specific rock formations she'd memorized in the first hour of her position. She counted wind cycles. She timed the gusts. She built a model in her head that was less a calculation than a felt certainty, the kind that competence eventually becomes when it passes beyond the point where it needs to explain itself. She had 3 rounds. She thought for a long time. Then she fired once. The sound of the shot went sideways in the wind and was gone before anyone in the outpost could locate its direction. The crack of impact, if it reached the outpost at all in those conditions, would have arrived 10 seconds later and been indistinguishable from the ordinary sounds of cold stone. But in the creek bed at the base of the far ridge, something changed. The radio chatter intercepted by the outpost's signals officer, the garbled fragments they'd been tracking for 2 hours, stopped. It simply stopped. The assault never came. In the morning, a recovery team confirmed the engagement. The senior officer who wrote the after-action report used the word remarkable 4 times and then crossed all 4 out because it seemed inadequate and substituted instead a series of technical measurements that told the same story, with less emotion. Vivienne had already field-stripped the rifle by then, wrapped it in canvas, and said nothing to anyone about what she'd used or how she'd used it. The official record was precise about the distance and the result. It was silent about almost everything else. She was good at silence. She had built a life around it. Back in the present, Callum Ford had the rifle on his bench. The mockery was gone. Not replaced by reverence. He wasn't built for reverence. Replaced by something more useful, attention. He worked systematically. He field-stripped the action, noted that the internal components were in significantly better condition than the exterior, suggested someone had packed the internals against moisture before storage, not recently. The bolt was smooth past the grime, the locking lugs even and unmarked. Whoever had maintained this rifle had maintained it, not the appearance of it. He measured the crown. He expected damage. The barrel exterior was rough enough to suggest it. Instead, the crown was clean. Not factory clean, better than factory clean. Someone had recrowned this, carefully, with knowledge. He found the trigger group. He sat with it under the magnifying lamp for 4 full minutes. Then he said, quietly, to no one in particular, "This isn't stock." The geometry of the sear engagement was wrong. Wrong meaning not standard, not wrong meaning bad. The angles had been altered. The break weight, he estimated from feel, was somewhere around 8 ounces, roughly half of what the military platform would have shipped with. The creep was non-existent. The over-travel was minimal to the point of being invisible. Someone had done this by hand, not with a drop-in kit, not from a parts list. By hand, with tools and time and an understanding of exactly what the trigger needed to be in order to do what the shooter required. "This is custom work," he said. The woman was standing at the counter, watching him. 1,400 hours of it, she said. Over 4 years. He looked up. "You built this trigger?" She didn't answer that directly. She said, "The barrel crown was done with a brass rod and lapping compound. The trigger geometry took 8 iterations. The 3rd iteration was the hardest to give up because it felt good but it wasn't right. There's a difference." Callum stared at the trigger assembly in his hands. "The scope rings are mismatched," he said. "Different manufacturers. Different height. Deliberate. Compensates for a chin weld issue I had at extreme prone positions. Factory rings never accommodated it correctly. The mismatch achieves the same sight plane at the cost of aesthetics." He turned the rifle over. He was quiet for a while. "The modifications don't follow any protocol I know. They follow mine," she said. He set the rifle down slowly. "You asked for an assessment," he said. "What do you actually want me to assess? This rifle doesn't need work. The exterior is cosmetic. The internals are." He searched for the right word. Considered. Every choice is considered. It's not factory, and it's not conventional custom, and it's doing things I'd argue shouldn't be possible with this platform. But they are possible. Someone made them possible. He paused. "So, what's the question?" "I want to know," she said, "if it can still do what it was built to do." The shooting range outside Callum's shop was 40 minutes east, on private agricultural land owned by a man named Bert Clayes, who charged a range fee and never asked questions, which was why Callum used it. The main berm ran to 1,000 yards, but the property extended further, a long flat corridor that ended against a granite hillside that Bert had fitted with steel targets at measured distances by a surveyor friend. The farthest target was at 1,800 yards. They drove separately. Callum had his own truck. The woman drove something old and nondescript that had mud on the wheel wells and a cracked side mirror that had been secured with wire. It was 7:15 in the evening by the time they reached the range. The rain had stopped. The air was cold and very clear, the kind of clear that follows rain and precedes frost. Callum set up his own equipment first. He was running a modern precision platform. He'd built himself a 300 Winchester Magnum on a custom chassis, with a first focal plane optic worth more than most people's first cars. He mounted it on bags, dialed his dope for the conditions, ran a cold bore at 500 yards, and adjusted. He offered to let her use his equipment. She declined without discussion. She had brought the rifle. She had also brought from somewhere in that mud-streaked vehicle a bag that he hadn't seen, from which she produced a set of iron sight adjustments that looked hand-filed, a brass cleaning rod, and 4 rounds of ammunition that she'd loaded herself. He could see the neck tension of the case mouths, tight and consistent. She'd weighed the charges. He could tell, because they were all the same, not approximately the same, but exactly the same, the uniformity of someone who measured to the 10th of a grain. She cleared the action, loaded, went prone on a mat she'd unrolled from the bag with the efficiency of someone who had performed this sequence in darkness, in cold, on terrain that did not accommodate comfort. "Call the target," she said. Callum looked at her. "Which one?" "The far one." The far target was at 1,800 yards. It was a 12-inch circle of steel. He said, "You don't have a scope. Iron sights at 1,800 yards is." "Call the target." He picked up his spotting scope. He dialed it in on the steel disc at the base of the granite hill, barely visible in the last of the evening light. "Ready," he said. The report of the shot was sharp in the cold air. He watched through the spotting scope. The 12-inch circle rang. He didn't say anything for a moment. He pulled his eye from the scope. "Again," she said. "You've got 3 more rounds." "I know." He called the target again. The second round took the steel at its upper edge. He heard the ring from where he sat. He lowered the spotting scope. His own rifle sat on the bags, unshot. He'd planned to run his own strings, demonstrate his own capability, perhaps show her what a modern precision system could do. The plan had not survived contact with what he'd just watched. "How?" he said. Not a complete question, just the beginning of one. She rose from the mat in a single movement. She cleared the chamber. She didn't look at the target. "I've fired that distance or more," she said, "over 100 times. With this rifle?" "With this rifle." "In actual field conditions?" She looked at him. It was the first time she'd looked at him with anything that acknowledged him as a person rather than a technician. It wasn't warmth. Exactly. It was the look of someone choosing how much to say. "Field conditions were worse," she said. 40-knot crosswind, 0 optical support, temperature differential that would have thrown your data off by 6 inches at that range. He thought about the record in the database. 3,540 meters. "The entry in the archive," he said. "The restricted one." She began rolling the mat. "There's a classified addendum," she said, "that describes the wind conditions and the equipment state at time of engagement." She secured the mat. "I've read it. It's accurate. I submitted it myself." Callum was quiet. He'd spent his career believing in the primacy of systems, of data, of measurable, repeatable performance. He built rifles the way engineers build bridges, with margins of error accounted for, with redundancies, with the assumption that the human variable was the weakest link in the chain and should be minimized by good design. He looked at the rifle in her hands. It was ugly. It was improvised. It was the product of 1,400 hours of work that followed no protocol he recognized. It had just done something his engineered system had not been asked to do. "You could have used a modern platform," he said. "They'd have given you whatever you asked. You had to be running something experimental or classified anyway, given the program reference." "I was offered," she said. "I declined." She looked at the rifle, not at him, at the rifle. "Because I knew this one," she said. "I knew where it would go under conditions I couldn't predict. A new system has a learning curve you pay for with margin. I didn't have margin to spare." She put the rifle back in the canvas bag. "I've had this conversation before," she said. "With people who build guns for a living, they want me to tell them the system is what matters, that the engineering is the talent." She zipped the bag. "The engineering is the foundation. The talent is what happens after you've exhausted what the engineering can tell you." He asked her on the drive back, via text to her number. She'd given it to him in the parking lot of Bert Clays's range with no explanation, written on the back of a fuel receipt. "Who were you?" "Exactly." She called him instead. "Ghost Sniper," she said, when he answered. That's what they called the incident in theater. The personnel who were in the outpost that night filed informal reports afterward. The term spread. He was in his truck, heater running. The dark road ran straight ahead through empty farmland. "Ghost Sniper," he repeated. The operational designation was Echo Zero. It was assigned retroactively after the record was confirmed. I never used it. "Were you decorated?" A pause. "The decoration exists. It's in a sealed personnel file under a name that isn't the one I use now." Another pause. "Classified programs have classified personnel. The people who authorized the engagement couldn't formally acknowledge the engagement without acknowledging the program. So the medal was awarded, and the file was sealed, and I went back to work." "And then?" "And then I was done," she said. 2 years after that engagement, I separated from service. I've been private since. Different city, different name in regular use, different life." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not a mystery. I'm a person who wanted to stop." "What made you come in today?" he asked. "To the shop." The rifle needs a professional inspection, she said. I've maintained it myself, but I'm not a gunsmith. The barrel is approaching the end of its service life. The pitting is cosmetic, but I need someone with measuring equipment to tell me if the throat erosion is within tolerance. A pause. And I wanted someone who works with guns to see it, not for sentiment, for record. Someone should know that rifle exists and what it did. Why me? You're the best in a reasonable distance, she said flatly. Your competition results are in the public record. Your work is documented. I didn't need someone who'd be impressed. I needed someone competent who'd be honest. I laughed at it, he said. I know. That didn't bother you? It told me what I needed to know about your starting assumptions, she said, which were wrong. That's fine. Starting assumptions usually are. He drove. The heater hummed. The throat erosion, he said. I'll measure it properly tomorrow. I'll need to run it through a bore scope. I know. The barrel can be replaced. Matched to the existing action, I could rechamber it in the same caliber, same twist rate. The work you've done to the trigger and bedding would carry over. Silence. She'd still be herself, he added, and wasn't entirely sure why he said it that way. Another silence. Longer. Yes, the woman said. That's the point. I don't know your name, he said. Vivienne, she said. Vivienne Holt. He would later look up the name in every available record. He would find nothing attached to a ghost sniper, nothing attached to Echo Zero, nothing attached to a program designation or a classified engagement or a medal in a sealed file. He would find a property record in a small town 2 states away, a library card issued 11 years ago, a registered vehicle with a cracked side mirror. That was all. He found himself oddly satisfied by this. It seemed correct. The data matched the person. She came back on Saturday. The rain had moved on. The sky was the specific shade of pale blue that October produces in the northeast before it turns gray for 6 months, a brief, lucid interval, like clarity on its way somewhere else. Callum had the rifle on the bench. He'd run it through the bore scope Friday morning. The throat erosion was within the outer edge of tolerance, another few hundred rounds, and it would start to impact performance. But it was not there yet. He'd measured the muzzle crown again and confirmed what he'd seen initially. Clean, precise, hand done to a standard that embarrassed him slightly. He'd spent Friday evening at his bench not working but thinking, which was something he didn't do often enough to have a comfortable habit for it. He'd pulled out the rifle he'd dismissed in the summer the old, 30-06, that the nostalgic customer had brought in. The one Callum had returned with minimal work and maximum skepticism. He'd looked at it differently. He hadn't changed his opinion of it. It was a poorly maintained post-war platform with nothing exceptional about it, but he'd looked at it differently, as an object that had been somewhere, that had passed through hands, had absorbed context that wasn't visible. He didn't know what to do with that. Not yet. Vivienne Holt arrived at 9 in the morning. He showed her the bore scope results. Within tolerance, she said, looking at the numbers. For now, I'd estimate you have a season of serious use before it starts to cost you at distance. That's useful. I can replace the barrel. I have a contact who blanks them to order premium steel, hand-lapped, match chamber. I'd need 2 weeks. She was quiet for a moment. She ran her thumb along the barrel's exterior, the pitted surface, the rough steel that had been somewhere and come back from it. Not yet, she said. He understood, which surprised him, since he'd built his entire professional identity on the argument that sentiment had no place in engineering. I want to show you something, he said. He brought out the measurements he'd taken of the trigger geometry. He'd modeled it roughly, on graph paper, which was how he thought best, away from screens. He'd reverse engineered her modifications and mapped the logic of each choice. The sear geometry, he said, spreading the paper on the counter. The angle you cut here, it's not on any standard diagram I know. I modeled it 3 ways, trying to understand what it was doing. He pointed. It's reducing the dynamic friction during the firing cycle. Not just lightening the pull, changing the character of the break, making it more consistent across temperature variations. He looked up at her. Cold trigger versus warm trigger. Most precision shooters accept a difference. It's in the data. You compensate. You've essentially eliminated the variable. She looked at the diagram. It took 2 years to get the angle right, she said. I ruined 3 trigger groups finding it. How did you know to look for it? I missed a shot, she said simply. Temperature had dropped 40 degrees between my morning checkout and the evening engagement. I dialed correctly. Everything else was within parameters. I missed. She looked at the diagram. I spent 6 months understanding why. Callum looked at the paper. You should have published this, he said. I didn't own the context it came from, she said. The program. The engagement. You can't publish a solution to a problem that's classified. He nodded. Can I write it up? He said. For my own records, not published, just documented. She looked at him for a moment. Yes, she said. Documented. He did. It took 3 hours that afternoon, with her sitting across the counter answering questions in that precise, economical way of hers. He filled 12 pages in a composition notebook with diagrams, measurements, and her answers. At the end, he had something that was not a manual and not a memoir, something between them, a record of knowledge that had been earned in a place and under conditions he would never experience. When they were finished, she picked up the canvas bag. I'll be back for the barrel conversation, she said. When the tolerance runs out, I'll be here, he said. She walked toward the door. He said, the shot. In the field, the 3,540-meter engagement. He wasn't sure why he was asking. Was there a moment when you knew it would connect? Before you fired? She stopped. She considered the question seriously, which he appreciated. No, she said. There's never a moment of knowing. There's a moment of deciding that everything you can do, and you've done, and that the remaining uncertainty is smaller than the requirement. She turned slightly. It's not confidence. It's a form of accounting. You count what you've done correctly, you count what you cannot control, and if the first list is longer than the second, you fire. She pushed open the door. The October light came in cold and clean. Most people, she said, never learn to be honest about which list is longer. The door closed behind her. Callum didn't hang the rifle on the wall. That would have been wrong. The rifle wasn't his to display, and besides, she'd taken it with her. What he hung instead was the diagram, the 12-page composition notebook's key diagram, the trigger geometry map, reproduced in clean ink on a piece of drafting paper and framed in plain black behind the counter. Most customers didn't ask about it, Dawson asked. Callum told him. Not everything, some of it wasn't his to tell, but enough. The rifle, the range, the numbers. Dawson was quiet for a long time after. Then he said, so what changed? Callum thought about that. My assumption about what the gun is, he said, finally. I thought the gun was the variable, that better engineering meant better outcomes, that the highest performing system would produce the highest performing result. He looked at the diagram on the wall. The gun is the foundation. I was right about that, but I was treating it like a ceiling. Dawson looked at the diagram. She used iron sights, he said, at 1,800 yards. A pause. In the field, Callum added, she didn't have anything. Dawson thought about that in the particular way of someone 19 years old encountering a fact that rearranges something. What do we do differently? He asked. It was a good question. Callum had been thinking about it since Saturday. We don't dismiss the old guns, he said. We look at them as records, evidence. Every modification someone made to a rifle, even a bad modification, is data about what they were trying to solve. If I look at a 1960s custom build and only see what it can't do against a modern platform, I'm throwing away information. He paused. Vivian Holt spent 1,400 hours on that rifle learning things that aren't in any manual. That's not sentiment. That's engineering that happened outside of institutional settings. He picked up the framed diagram, rehung it 2 inches higher, which is where it should have been from the start. We document everything from now on, he said. Every unusual modification a customer brings in, every solution someone built by hand that doesn't match the textbook. We keep records. Dawson nodded. And if someone brings in an old gun that looks like junk? Callum was quiet for a moment. We read the serial number first, he said, and we listen before we laugh. The rifle went through the season. Vivian Holt called twice in November, once to ask a technical question about ammunition temperature sensitivity at altitude, which Callum answered with a reference he'd specifically pulled because he'd anticipated she might ask it, once to report that the tolerance was holding. In January, she called again. "I think the barrel's ready," she said. "I think so too," he said, though he hadn't measured it since October. He trusted her. Read. 2 weeks? 2 weeks. I'll have my contacts start the blank this week. A silence. "The exterior of the new barrel," she said. "Don't polish it." "I wasn't going to. And don't ask me to put a modern stock on it." "I wasn't going to do that either." A longer silence, which functioned differently than a pause. A silence with texture. "You've changed the way you work," she said. It wasn't a question. "I've changed the way I look," he said. "The work is the same." "Is it?" He thought about the composition notebook on the shelf below the counter. About the 3 new entries he'd made since October 2 from customer rifles that had shown unusual hand modifications. One from a Milzerp bolt action. An estate sale had brought in that had a barrel bedding arrangement he'd never encountered and couldn't find in any reference, and had therefore documented carefully, and spent a week thinking about. "No," he admitted, "it isn't quite the same." She said, "Good." And then the line was quiet, the way a cleared chamber is quiet, not empty, but ready. The diagram stayed on the wall. New customers sometimes asked about it. Callum developed a short answer that was accurate without being complete. It's a custom trigger geometry developed by a precision shooter over 4 years of field use. It solves a problem that factory design doesn't address. If they asked who developed it, he said, "Someone who was very good at understanding what she needed and very patient about learning to build it." If they asked where the original rifle was, he said, "It's still in use." Which was true. Vivienne Holt had the rifle back in February. The new barrel installed, the exterior left as worked, the stock unchanged and unmodified, and still cracked at the pistol grip, and still wrapped in the dried paracord that had been there long enough to become part of the story rather than a repair. She'd taken it to a range in the mountains and fired a 3-shot group at 800 yards that Callum, had he been there to see it, would have photographed and framed. She hadn't photographed it. She'd recorded the data in a notebook she'd been keeping for 14 years, a water-damaged composition book, not dissimilar to Callum's, filled with range conditions, results, and the iterative record of a person building expertise the way stone is laid, one piece at a time, with attention to what came before. The barrel work was seamless. The trigger was what the trigger had always been. The rifle was, as she'd said it would be, itself. She drove back through the mountains in the old nondescript vehicle, the cracked side mirror wired in place, the canvas bag on the passenger seat. The sun was low, and the light on the snow-covered peaks was the specific gold of late winter afternoon in high country, the kind of light that makes the ordinary briefly sacred. She didn't feel like a legend. She felt like someone who had learned a difficult thing over a long time and was still learning it, which was the only honest way to feel about anything that mattered. Somewhere in a shop 40 minutes west of the mountains, a young gunsmith with fire in his hands and considerably less contempt in his eyes was looking at a rifle a customer had brought in old, rough-handled, modified in ways that didn't match the manual, and reaching for a yellow notepad before he reached for an opinion. He was writing down what he saw. He was listening